And there we go. Hi, Bert, Georgette, why don't you join us? Hello, everybody. My name is David Kramer, and I am director of the library at the Jewish Theological Seminary. And as many of you know, it has been our privilege over the course of years, and actually an increased privilege due to the number of people who can make it near and far for our book talks and presentations online. So here we are. And we pride ourselves in providing programs that will introduce people to important new books of Jewish interest. And that is exactly what we've got tonight. I will let my colleague Bert Visotsky do the formal introductions to the book and the author. I just want to, before we do that, express my gratitude as director of the library to Georgette. Georgette and her husband, Leonard Polonsky, were really visionary leaders in appreciating the great importance of digitization for libraries like ours. Many of you know that the Library of the Jewish Theological Seminary is the location of collections for, one of the most astounding collections of rare Judaica in the world. And we want to do our best to provide access to it, whether you can come to the library or whether you find yourselves on the other side of the globe. And in order to make that possible, Georgette and Leonard funded the creation of the Polonsky Digitization Lab in memory of Rabbi Mark Tanenbaum. And in connection with that grant, provided very substantial initial funding for one of our earliest and largest digitization project. And Georgette, you would be happy to know, I think you do know, but also to see that our photography, our creation of new digital versions of our rare materials continues in that lab each and every day. And so visitors, scholars from around the world are grateful to you, whether they recognize you as the source of what is being done there or not. But certainly we will retain our gratitude forever. So again, everybody,
and
please
David,
stay on mute.
David, we're grateful to you.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you. We're glad to be able to cooperate and make that kind of access possible. So Bert, why don't you take it? I'm going to spotlight you and take it away. Let me find spotlight for everyone. There you go.
Thank you, Professor Kramer. I do want to recognize that the Chancellor Emeritus of the Jewish Theological Seminary, Professor Arnie Eisen, is on the screen somewhere, if you can see him. And I want to thank Arnie for being instrumental in encouraging us to do this book talk with Georgette. So thank you, Professor Eisen. I just want to say a very few words of introduction, but I'm a rabbi, so before I start speaking, I have a few other words to say. So let me just give you the run of the evening. Once I introduce Georgette Bennett, she will speak for a while, about 20 to 30 minutes as she sees fit, about the content of her book. And then I will engage her in some back and forth about the book and its relevance to the terrible time we're living through right now. And then, as Professor Kramer indicated, we will have the opportunity to co-audience questions. You can put your questions into the chat. If you go into the chat, the very first thing you'll see on the chat is a link to the book on Amazon. So if you have an account at Amazon, you have the opportunity to buy the book, having heard the author. So, and I really highly recommend it's a deeply disturbing book in terms of what it reports, and yet at the same time, it is a profound recognition of the problem that we're facing. This is not surprising because Georgette Bennett is an award-winning sociologist, widely published author. She is an active philanthropist, as David has indicated. I want to note that in 1992, she founded the Tanenbaum Center for Interreligious Understanding. Her late husband, Mark Tanenbaum, was one of my heroes. He really paved the way for interreligious dialogue between the Jewish and Christian worlds in particular. And then in 2013, not content to sit on her laurels, seeing what was going on in the world, Georgette founded the Multifaith Alliance for Syrian Refugees. That Multifaith Alliance has to date raised over $400 million in humanitarian aid and on behalf of more than 3 million Syrian war victims. So Georgette not only writes, she walks the walk. She's there and she sees what needs to be done and she does it. To me, I'm saying this quite personally, and Georgette has heard it from me before. She is truly one of my heroes. I recognize that there are people in the world who could just sit back and rest on their laurels. And Georgette surely has lots of laurels to rest on, but she is indefatigable. She's out there really helping the world, and I must say is a constant role model for me. The book is Religicide, Confronting the Roots of Anti-Religious Violence. Dr. Bennett.
Thank you, Bert. You are always so generous in your introductions, and you always make my day, and not in the Dirty Harry sense. You always make me feel so good. So I may just have to steal you from Sandy and make sure that you're there every day to prop me up. And I want to thank you and David and Arnie, very good friend also, for inviting me to do this talk today. And I want to thank all of you who have your cameras on, because it's so nice to actually see who I'm talking to. So you've probably never heard the term religicide, and yet it describes the fastest type of violence in the world today, the fastest growing type of violence. So this evening, I'm going to explain what it is, where it's happening, why its perpetrators are getting away with murder in plain sight, and how to stop it. I want to open with a 16-year-old Yazidi woman. I'll call her Sipan. She was married and 2 months pregnant when she was enslaved, raped, and beaten by ISIS fighters who raided her village. She and her husband, along with tens of thousands of other Yazidis, were driven up Mount Sinjar and left there to starve. But with no food or water or shelter from the sun, they came back down only to be caught up in the nightmare genocide perpetrated by ISIS. Now, Sipan never heard from her husband again, and likely he was executed by ISIS, as were thousands of other Yazidi men. But after being kicked and beaten, she herself was thrown into the trunk of a car and spirited away to Syria. Those beatings cost her the child that she was carrying. Sipan was one of 7,000 Yazidi women and girls who were driven through markets and offered up for sale. And in the 3 years she was enslaved, Sipan was bought 4 times. The last time was by an Iraqi fighter who took her to Mosul to serve as a slave to his family. Now, you'd think that with a wife and children there, some mercy would be shown, but no, she was still raped, beaten, and starved. And then she became pregnant by her ISIS master. She, along with the remnants of the Yazidi community, was liberated in 2017. Yazidi religious authorities had decreed that ISIS captivity survivors were to be respected and created a purification ritual in order to reintegrate them into the community. But that did not apply to the illicit children of ISIS fighters, because under Yazidi laws of endogamy, children must have 2 Yazidi parents in order to be accepted into the community. So with a Muslim father, Sipan's daughter could not be considered Yazidi. So in order to be accepted, she had to give up her 1.5-year-old child to an aid agency, perhaps with good reason, because enslaving boys and training them as militants did more than strengthen ISIS fighting forces. it made Yazidi children a lethal threat to their own community. After all the trauma that she had endured, Sipan decided to kill herself, and that was true of many Yazidis. A friend stopped her. But 9 years after ISIS began its genocide, Sipan, along with most of the 400,000 displaced Yazidis, remained homeless and mired in trauma. A harsh and antiquated form of Islam was weaponized against these women to justify their enslavement. Now, rape has long been used as a weapon of war, including in Syria, but ISIS went even further. They used sexual slavery to wipe out religious identity and solidify their homogeneous caliphate. Ironically, the most brutal ISIS fighters were converts to Islam from liberal democracies like Germany, England, and Australia. The ISIS playbook, The Management of Savagery, foreshadows their scorched earth campaign against the Yazidis and gives it religious justification. Leave no survivors, poison wells, destroy homes, rape and enslave women to birth Muslim children, kill all Yazidi men, the elderly, and persons with disabilities, burn all evidence of their existence. The late Rabbi Jonathan Sacks used to say, when religion turns men into murderers, God weeps. And ISIS gave God plenty of reason to weep. So why does Yazidi pain resonate so deeply for me, a Western Jew whose life could not be more different than the pastoral life once led by this ancient and obscure religious group? Well, for one thing, we Jews, we know what it means to be enslaved, to be considered subhuman, to be demonized, to be the victims of violence with a purpose. And ISIS used some of the same techniques as the Nazis. I felt this most keenly as I wandered among the desolate barracks of the Birkenau concentration camp, part of the Auschwitz complex in Poland. This is where my grandparents literally went up in smoke, and where my father and other relatives were imprisoned. In fact, most of my family was killed in industrialized death factories like this, or they were shot dead in the streets. My parents were among the few who survived these horrors, and I was born in the immediate aftermath. We fled further persecution and came to the US in 1952 as stateless refugees. But even now, 71 years later, I remain riveted by religion and the violence that religion inspires. Was the Holocaust the first modern religicide? Probably. It was, after all, an attempt to wipe out an entire people. But the Holocaust led to the codification in law of two forms of human rights violations: crimes against humanity and genocide. An earlier law, war crimes, dates back to the 1800s. And in the 1990s, Bosnia contributed ethnic cleansing to our vocabulary of horror. But here's the thing. None of these terms fully define religicide. Religicide is the highly targeted attempt to wipe out an entire religion, its adherents, its habitats and sacred spaces, its entire cultural heritage. It encompasses all four of the human rights violations I just mentioned, but it goes beyond them to include ecocide, facticide, and often suicide. While the act of religicide against Yazidis is largely behind us, there are other full-blown religicides happening as we sit here today. Against Uyghurs and Tibetan Buddhists in China and Rohingya in Myanmar, and arguably earlier religicides were perpetrated by European colonizers against indigenous peoples in the Americas and Australia. But once we name it, we need to understand how it begins, with hate speech. Hate speech is hard to define, which makes it hard to prosecute without violating laws and norms related to freedom of expression. International laws don't prohibit hate speech. They only forbid incitement that deliberately triggers violence and discrimination. Now, the criminal justice system can only deal with the consequences of hate speech after it turns into a hate crime or mass atrocity. As of now, 33 countries have enacted hate crime legislation, but most of what's ruled illegal in these countries would be considered protected speech under the First Amendment of the US Constitution. But incitement to violence is excluded from that protection, and although the US has no national hate speech statutes, 47 out of 15 states have enacted hate crime legislation. And yet, hate speech is precisely the point at which we need to intervene in order to prevent religicide. There's an inexorable link between verbal violence and physical violence. It starts with dehumanizing the other with words that reduce them to caricatures filled with contempt. That kind of psychic numbing makes it easy to swing the hate-filled caricature from a lynching tree, or shove them into the fires of a Nazi oven, or shoot them at prayer in a mosque in New Zealand or a synagogue in Pittsburgh. The core precepts of each of the great religions are rooted in love, peace, and respect. But ironically, it's in religion that one also finds the roots of hate speech. That's because of group narcissism, the idea that one's own group holds a monopoly on truth. It's grounded in apocalyptic thinking that divides the world into the children of light and the children of darkness. So by virtue of being Black, foreign, Jewish, Catholic, Muslim, liberal, or gay, a person can be branded as impure and therefore fair game for bigoted scourges. American history is replete with linkages between moral fervor and physical violence. From the pious Puritans who burnt their witches, to the Ku Klux Klan who burnt their crosses, to neo-Nazis who march in Charlottesville proclaiming Jews will not replace us. World history gives us many more examples. Just look at the genocides in Bosnia, Rwanda, and Ethiopia. Genocides that began with leaders spewing hate speech. There are hundreds of intertwined laws, resolutions, declarations, and mandates designed to protect our right to believe what we want, how we want, where we want, and with whom we want, including the 30 articles of the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Yet almost all these rights are violated on a daily basis. That's because declarations, unlike conventions and treaties, are not legally binding. And even though conventions and treaties are binding, they often can't be enforced. Aspects of religicide are covered by these many different kinds of acts, but we're pushing for a new category of human rights abuse because there's nothing that completely covers it. So let me give you a few examples of where religicide slips through the cracks. In the 1960s, the UN General Assembly debated race and religion, even though both were already supposedly covered by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now, at that time, many countries in the global South and West wanted an international framework to end anti-religious violence, but geopolitics got in the way. Communist states had little appetite for advancing religious freedom and preferred instead to highlight systematic racism in the West. But a watered-down declaration was finally enacted in 1981, but like the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, it lacks the force of law. International human rights law and the UN statutes are directed at states. But what about non-state actors like ISIS? Despite its horrific religicide against the Yazidis in Iraq, there's nothing in the existing statutes that brings ISIS to justice. In cases like that, we're dependent on states to act, some of which are failed, some of which are autocratic, and some of which lack legitimacy. Facticide, which includes hate speech, disinformation, and incitement, is a key feature of religicide. But states are not obligated to move against these kinds of expression. Prosecuting religicide runs into more gaps in international law and more roadblocks in bringing the perpetrators to justice. Human rights law specifies the legal duties of states, but the International Criminal Court tries persons, not states or organizations or groups. Now, that might cover Vladimir Putin as an individual, but what about Syria, China, or Iran as rogue states? And what do we do with ISIS? What do we do with Hamas? According to the Nuremberg principles, following orders doesn't absolve an individual of responsibility for a human rights crime, but there are two contravening exceptions. First, the perpetrator was under legal obligation to obey. Second, the perpetrator didn't know the order was unlawful. Well, what's the definition of a legal obligation? What's the definition of unlawful? Can official government policy be unlawful? The actions of the Nazis were completely legal under German law, as are the actions of the Chinese Communist Party under Chinese laws. And so is Hamas's jihad under its own charter. The ICC can only try persons whose crimes were at the time committed under the jurisdiction of the court, but those crimes are limited to genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and aggression. Today's religicides don't fit neatly into any one of these categories, though they include elements of all of them. I mentioned earlier that destruction of cultural heritage is the feature of religicide, and there's actually a Hague Convention that covers that in the event of armed conflict, but there's a catch. Cultural property must be registered and marked with a specific emblem for protection. Now, that's great for large cultural landmarks recognized as World Heritage Sites, but it ignores sacred lands, rivers, and mountains, such as the Yazidi home in Shingal. And what about smaller sites, cemeteries, and articles of religious custom and practice that may reside inside homes for ritual use? What about scriptures and sacred books? And as was the case with the Nazis, what if the state charged with protecting cultural artifacts is the very force that wants to loot, burn, or trash them? And how do you protect or prosecute when the culprit is a non-state actor, such as ISIS, trying to wipe out the religion to which those artifacts are connected? And what if there's no armed conflict involved, like with the Chinese Uyghurs? But perhaps the biggest obstacle to ending religicide is the UN Security Council. Each permanent member has the right to veto any action brought before the council, and all actions must be unanimously approved. But when two of the greatest human rights violators in the world, Russia and China, sit on that council and veto any actions that are against their interests, that body is effectively crippled. The current international system is centered on protecting nation-state sovereignty at the expense of human rights. Humanitarian and human rights laws favor the protection of individual rights over collective or group rights, and these don't adequately address collective rights or environmental justice and ecological rights. So given all these gaps and obstacles in international bodies and law, we need to turn to civil society, business, grassroots organizations, and religious leaders to step in. Where a religicide pits one religion against another, faith leaders have a special responsibility to counter the toxic religious texts used to justify violence. They can provide sanctuary and houses of worship and use their convening power and moral persuasion to organize coalitions. When religious leaders enter into a global covenant to oppose religicide, they bring their collective moral authority to bear. Their ties to each other are less a treaty and more of a covenant. Now, although Britain and Western Europe have become more and more secular, the fact is that 84% of the world's population still identifies with a religion. And given that high birth rates are on their side, we can't rule out the importance of religious leaders. In 1992, as Bert said, I founded the Tanenbaum Center for Interreligious Understanding. One of our signature programs, Peacemakers in Action, demonstrates the role that religious leaders can play. When the Troubles in Northern Ireland first gained momentum in the 1970s, vigilantes on both the Loyalist and Irish Republican army sides patrolled the streets to protect their communities, instilling widespread fear. Reverend Roy McGee, a Protestant Belfast pastor, anticipated that the assembled crowds armed with sticks would explode into violence. He convinced his Protestant constituents to go home and assured them that he would personally patrol the streets every night to keep them safe. That was the beginning of 25 years of his peace activism. McGee's long-standing, pervasive moral presence on the ground gave him street credentials. McGee's counterpart on the Catholic side was Father Alec Reed, known as the IRA priest. Reed didn't just preach, he got down in the trenches. Reed established his own street creds by repeatedly responding to violence where it was happening and working in the notorious Maze prison with IRA hunger strikers and their families. And although his ministry was IRA focused, an iconic photo of him went viral around the world. In that photo, he's kneeling over a fallen British soldier on the street, administering last rites to the enemy. Now, that compassion illustrates the traditional orientation to peace and goodwill and ultimate respect for humanity that religious leaders bring to the table. And that can interrupt narratives of anger, victimhood, and hate. It was these two clergymen who negotiated the IRA and Loyalist paramilitary ceasefires that made Northern Ireland's Good Friday Agreement possible. Religious leaders are part of a top-down, middle-out, bottom-up approach that we outline in our book, Religicide. The full program is in our book, so I'm just going to throw out a few nuggets. Governments can admit more religicide refugees and provide much more aid to restore survivors and their communities. Global business leaders can alter their supply chains so as to not support perpetrators of religicide. We can set up early warning systems to detect weaponized language as a prelude to violence. We can take a public health approach. Like the spread of a disease, violence can be stopped with early intervention. Above all, advocates and survivors of religicide must have their voices heard. Rehumanizing the dehumanized victims of religicide is a big step in preventing further atrocities. Counter-messaging based on sound social psychological principles, some of which are intuited by religious leaders, is an important part of ending religicide. Finally, it's important to look at all ongoing regicides as a group rather than allowing their perpetrators to divide and conquer. Religicide must be treated as a global issue with a global response. I'd like to end this talk where I began, with a heartfelt cry from a Yazidi woman. She's Nobel Peace Prize winner Nadia Murad. She says, "We must do more than merely endure. We must work toward a future in which the entire world, not only Yazidis, says never again."
Thank you, Georgette, for that thoroughly depressing, but very realistic tour of what's going on in the world. You gave us a poignant example from the Yazidi in Iraq, but you also mentioned the Rohingya, the Buddhist monks, the Uyghur, even indigenous people in America and Australia. You also mentioned, and it really caught my attention, ecological offense. Can you expand a little bit on how our ecological crimes and sins are part of the religicide world?
Well, there are lots of ecological crimes and sins which are not related to religicide, but those sins can be incorporated in a religicidal campaign.
Mm-hmm.
For example, in Tibet, China has completely changed the landscape there and the traditional ways in which Tibetans herd. It has also greatly affected in the process the way water is channeled over there. And that is all part of religicide that has to do with destroying sacred spaces, sacred lands, as one way of detaching adherents from their religion and wiping out any remnant of that religion. In the case of the Yazidis, their land was completely destroyed. Wells were stuffed with all kinds of objects so that they couldn't be used. Orchards were burnt. And again, this was a way of detaching the Yazidis from their sacred land. Now, of course, in Jewish history, we have lots of instances in which there was an attempt to detach us from our sacred lands. So those are just a couple of examples, Bert.
That is actually very clarifying for me, and I appreciate it. I do want to come back to your criticism of the United Nations, because in addition, of course, to the Security Council, there is the General Assembly, and then there are things that the UN Secretary General can also have. So, for instance, I've been involved with a special advisor to the Secretary General, and we created something called the UN Plan of Action for the Prevention of Incitement to Violence Leading to Genocide. So it's a big mouthful. But you're right, there's no punishment associated.
That was one of my source materials, Bert.
Well, I mean, I'm happy we put it out there. It's a wonderful thing. We have traveled the globe essentially using the UN bully pulpits to say to people, not on our watch, you're not going to do this, that, or the other. But beyond that bully pulpit, beyond the fact that different religious leaders can stand shoulder to shoulder and set an example, there isn't much teeth in our opposition to this kind of incitement to violence.
That's exactly right, Bert. Not much teeth, even when there are mechanisms to address these things. But beyond that, a lot of gaps in international law, which we've tried to identify in this book. And religicide slips right through those gaps.
So I'm again going to remind, I see some people have already put some questions into the chat, and we welcome that. But at the very top of the chat, there is a link to the book. And I think people really listening have gotten a taste of the options that the book talks about. You didn't mention, or at least I didn't hear, something that I think really captures people in the US, and that's Christian white supremacism, Christian nationalism. Do you see that as somewhere within the realm of the religicide map?
Well, one needs to examine it in terms of the elements of religicide. Certainly hate speech, and that's where all regicides begin. hate speech, disinformation, dehumanization, incitement to violence. So there's number one. Another element of it is genocide. I'm not seeing white supremacy as being genocidal at this point, although there are certain groups of white supremacists that are looking to incite a race war. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean genocide. It means war. Another element of religicide is ecocide. I'm not seeing ecocides perpetrated by white supremacists against the groups they hate, especially Jews. Facticide, yes, because of all the disinformation, the leaning on the protocols of the elders of Zion. And by the way, you see that also in the Hamas charter, the long screed against the Jews, the conspiracy theory that is in the Hamas charter. They cite the protocols of the elders of Zion, a proven forgery, as their source. And of course, you have white supremacist groups also drawing on the protocols for their conspiracy theories. So I don't see that as religicide, certainly not yet, and I'm not sure ever. But I do see it as intense hate and as being very, very dangerous.
So that's actually a good distinction. Something can be hateful and dangerous and not necessarily fall under the rubric of religicide.
Absolutely. Are they trying to wipe out the entire Jewish cultural heritage? No, that's a very important part of religicide. In fact, that may be the most distinctive part of religicide, because that's what differentiates it from just being a plain old genocide. The attempt to wipe out the entire cultural heritage of a religion, you know, any sign that it ever even existed.
So you've mentioned now a couple of times, Georgette, and you were reluctant when we prepared for this and had a conversation a couple of weeks ago, but a couple of weeks have indeed passed. The horrific events of October 7th and the destruction that Hamas wrought and continues to do against not just Israelis, but against the Jewish world. And you mentioned the Hamas charter as being particularly anti-Semitic, not just anti-Israel. Can you talk a little bit more about how the current situation with Hamas fits within the rubric of religicide, and what are your concerns, and maybe even is there any recourse?
So I mentioned the Hamas charter, and so did you. But when one talks about the Hamas charter, in order to respond to your question, Bert, the question is which charter? There was a charter in 1988. That was the original charter. And there was a charter, a revised charter in 2017. The one in 1988 explicitly called for killing Jews. And they quote from the Quran, "The day of judgment will not come about until Muslims fight Jews and kill them. Then the Jews will hide behind rocks and trees, and the rocks and trees will cry out, 'Oh, Muslim, there is a Jew hiding behind me. Come and kill him.'" Well, as you know, Bert, because you do so much work with Muslims, there are these kinds of incitements in the Quran, as there are in the sacred texts of all religions.
Yes, including the Torah.
Including the Torah, and how. So this is where religious leaders becomes so important, so that they can contextualize the history within which things like this come up. But in any case, that disappears in the 2017 charter, which includes a clause that is totally the opposite of this. The 2017 charter says Hamas affirms that its conflict is with the Zionist project, not with the Jews because of their religion. Hamas does not wage a struggle against the Jews because they are Jewish, but wages a struggle against the Zionists who occupy Palestine. Yet it is the Zionists who constantly identify Judaism and the Jews with their own colonial project and illegal entity. Hamas rejects the persecution of any human being or the undermining of his or her rights on nationalist, religious, or sectarian grounds. Hamas is of the view that the Jewish problem, anti-Semitism, and the persecution of the Jews are phenomena fundamentally linked to European history and not to the history of the Arabs and the Muslims or to their heritage, which is a very, very interesting change in which Hamas looks to clean up its act.
Yeah, so I just
updated charter.
I mean, I'll use the technical term. To me, it just sounds like a lot of bullshit. But can you talk about a little? I think you touched on an important point, that Hamas is very much engaged in a public relations war, and that's part of their battle here, and that they are trying to clean up their act, as though the events of October 7th could ever be cleansed.
Correct. They really can't be cleansed. And because Hamas is, in a sense, a state actor, even though they took over government of Hamas, not by election, but by a violent coup.
Of Gaza.
Of Gaza. What did I say?
Hamas. It's okay.
Hamas.
Yeah.
I've got Hamas on the brain. We've all got Hamas on the brain. So they took over the government of Gaza through a violent coup. And but because they are now a functioning government, I think that they can be held to account for war crimes, for crimes against humanity. Certainly ethnic cleansing is part of their ambition, although they do say that Jews, Muslims, and Christians could continue to live in a country that is Muslim from river to the sea, so long as the supremacy of Islam is not questioned. They are I don't see them fulfilling one of the criteria of religicide, which is destroying cultural heritage. I don't see any sign that they're trying to destroy the cultural heritage of Jews, but they are trying to destroy and deny the connection of Jews to the land.
Yes.
So that begins to creep toward religicide. Are they engaging in a genocide against Jews? I'm not sure.
Yeah, well, we hope not.
That's not entirely clear. And genocide is a component of religicide.
In the broad scheme of things, and I am obviously painfully aware that I, as a Jew, as a rabbi, as a professor at JTS, have a rather Judeo-centric worldview. But you've laid out really a disturbing amount of religicide, much of it actually against Muslims.
That's true. That's true.
So how do we account for, I mean, yes, against Muslims, but, you know, if we were in India, we could find Hindus versus Buddhists. What is it about our religious sensibility?
Yeah, Hindus versus Muslims.
Yes.
And based on what I have been reading, although when I speak to Indians, they say that that's not what it looks like on the ground. But based on what I've been reading, I fear the beginnings of a religicide in India under Hindu nationalism.
So, we talked about white Christian nationalism. Now you've mentioned Hindu nationalism. What is it about the religious sensibility at large that leads us to this kind of exclusivist worldview that even allows for this kind of disdain of the other, leading ultimately to murder?
Well, as I said in my remarks, I trace it all back to group narcissism, the feeling that your own religion holds the monopoly on truth, the apocalyptic thinking that leads to, because apocalyptic thinking automatically divides the world into the children of light and the children of darkness. So immediately you're doing othering. We are the righteous ones. We are the good ones. You are the bad ones. Because you're bad, I can dehumanize you. I can define you as subhuman. I can define you as not worthy. And therefore, I am doing a great social good by wiping you out. This,
Wow.
by the way, was very much the way Turkish doctors who participated in the Armenian Genocide, they were key players in that. And their loyalty was to the state, and because they were helping to kill Armenians who were really seen as bacteria, they were doing something good for the world by helping to get rid of this vermin, these bacteria.
I'm getting a message from my colleague, Professor Kramer. This would be a good time to put your questions in the chat. And David, do we have any questions that you'd like to share with Georgette now?
Well, I don't see any right here. I don't know if people have sent questions to you separately, but I just intended that as an invitation to everyone who's been listening.
Yes, so if you have questions, put them in the chat. I'm listening to what you're saying, Georgette, and I'm getting a creepy feeling because I am aware that in our own Jewish liturgy, we are perpetrators of a similar type of chauvinism. When we say Kiddush on Friday night, we proclaim that God chose us from among all the people. Like we're special and nobody else is. By the way, in my house, when I say Kiddush, I change one letter. And instead of saying from among all the people, I say with all the other people. I think we're all chosen.
Well, I think that concept of chosenness is completely misunderstood.
Oh, okay.
And to the extent that it's one of the triggers for anti-Semitism, I think it's very important to understand that chosenness has nothing to do with being chosen for special privilege. It has everything to do with being chosen for special responsibility. Tikkun olam, our responsibility to be partners to God in perfecting the world.
Amen. I mean, that, no. There's many reasons you're my hero, Georgette, and I think I'm going to have to start calling you my rabbi as well. I mean, you're totally right that we are certainly chosen to perform the mitzvot. And, if there are observant Jews who are on this call, they know very well that there are lots of mitzvot that sometimes our chosenness seems quite burdensome. But still, it makes us who we are. And that does not necessarily mean that we are leading to hate or to killing everyone else. I'm just seeing what I'm getting here.
There's a very important question there about how religious leaders can speak to their co-religionists. Do you see that, Bert?
Yeah, why don't you read it aloud, David?
Yeah, okay. So Georgette, someone who's on asks, how can leaders of other religious groups speak to their co-religionists concerning Jewish students and communities who could be terrorized by the current anti-Israel protests in the world and on universities? I think that's both a specific question, but I would also generalize it, and you've touched on this. How can religious leadership actually struggle against some of the worst tendencies that you've described and support the best tendencies of what religion has to offer?
So there are a number of assets that religious leaders and religious institutions bring to the table. Of course, one of the ways to deal with that, which I mentioned earlier, which is the responsibility to interpret toxic religious texts, which can be used as justifications for violence and extremism. But on a more practical level, getting beyond hermeneutics, religious leaders and religious institutions have vast constituencies that they can mobilize. They have sophisticated communication networks that can be employed for messaging. They tend to be there, now speaking, on an international level in terms of conflicts. They are there before and during and after the UN peacekeepers leave. So they have a lot of moral authority, and they have a lot of grassroots networking possibilities. So these are things that religious leaders can do. And in fact, one of the things, I have a formula that I apply, maybe some of you have seen my TED talk about this, in confronting any overwhelming problem in which I'd like to make a difference. It's a simple formula. Find an entry point, identify a gap, and find something doable with which to fill that gap. And then stay tightly focused on that, because if you've let yourself focus on the big picture, you'll be paralyzed into inaction. So similarly, in speaking to one of your colleagues, Bert, a fellow rabbi, we were sitting and thinking, well, what can we do? Because so many people have jumped in to address what's going on now in Gaza and in Israel. But what we hadn't seen, to your question that was just read in the chat, what we haven't seen is a mobilization of religious leaders, multi-faith leaders, stepping in at the point where diplomacy breaks down. And diplomacy broke down at the point where that hospital explosion happened in Gaza. Of course, the immediate response was this was Israel's fault. We've since learned it was not. It was a rocket fired from Gaza. So that's actually something that we're working on right now, mobilizing religious leaders. So Bert, I will be reaching out to you as we get to the next steps on this.
I welcome that.
It's just very early days, very early days.
Look, we all need to do whatever we can. I do want to say, though, for people listening, I have spent years cultivating colleagues in the Christian and Muslim community. And the current destruction that's going on in Gaza, the war with Hamas, has been a real test of loyalty. Some of my colleagues have disappointed me, but I dare say a number of my Muslim colleagues have reached out not only with sympathy, but with unity. A number of my Christian colleagues have done the same. I think I should particularly single out the Cardinal Archbishop of New York, Timothy Dolan, who has been enormously sympathetic and personally lovely to me in what he knows is a very difficult time for the Jewish community. And that is something I think you're right, that as religious leaders, we all, and when I say religious leaders, I mean pretty much everybody on this Zoom call as well. You can count yourself a religious leader. That we do have a voice, we do have a responsibility. And Georgette, as always, I welcome your marching orders because I say this, and you know me well enough to know that I say it not just to soap you, but because you do the right thing and you do it with a great deal of thought, and then you bring people with you. And I think that's what's called for here. I think your notion of religicide that you've laid out tonight in the last hour is an example of the kind of thinking you do. You didn't just write about the problem, you wrote about some solutions to the problem. So let me commend everyone on the call, our high-tech Religicide. The book is available on Amazon. If you go into the chat, the very first link in the chat is a link to Amazon if you have an Amazon account and want to buy it there, or at a bookstore near you. It is really worth your reading because it will cause you to think not only about the current circumstance in Gaza, but about the ways in which religion serves peace, and unfortunately, the ways in which religion does not. And I want to thank you, Georgette, as I'm sure everyone on the call benefited from your wisdom and your panache. I really, and Dr. Kramer, do you have any final words for us?
I would just add, thank you, Georgette, and thank you, Bert, for really helping to create a wonderful and engaging discussion, one that's challenging for all of us, given the world in which we live. But the more thoughtful we are about that world, maybe we can preserve a little bit of hope about next steps. So again, Georgette, thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And we invite you back to other book talks in the future. We hope you'll join us.
And thank you from me as well for your interest and your attention. I very much appreciate it.
Okay. Good night,
everybody.
everybody.
And good night.